Can you all hear me now better?
Yep, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, good. We had two computers on the same Wi-Fi and it was just too much. So, all right, welcome for second to last webinar of the South Dakota Legislature program. We're excited today to have you all here. We're going to go through trying to get our screens to go. So again, just as an introduction, we have all probably are familiar with each other now, but you know, your legislative planning committee. We have Amber Erickson, who's in the Brookings office. We have Caroline Hanson, who is the 4-H program advisor for Hanson-Davidson County. Myself, the 4-H volunteer development field specialist, and Hillary Reisner, who is located out at the Rapid City office. And again, you all know, you know, to contact us if you have any questions or anything regarding your program. You all have been in contact with your individual LRC group, and so hopefully you're familiar enough and know who to go to with those questions. All right, so where we are at, this is kind of exciting as we get close to the October 3rd event in Pierre. You guys have done a lot of work and a lot of fun things up until this point. We have 3 more things to check off our list. And so kind of where we're at now, we have our webinar that we're doing today, and we have our final bills that we'll be doing on September 25th is the due date for those. And then we have 1 more webinar before the event on October 3rd. For those of you who are on here today, we are going to spend some time at the end of the webinar working on bills, kind of finding the holes in them for those of you that are here, and problem solving some of the things to help strengthen those bills. All right, so our agenda for today, we've got a guest speaker, Representative Caleb Fink. So we're excited to have him. He's going to talk a little bit about the committee and caucus process, and then we are going to talk about what it's going to look like for you as South Dakota 4-H legislators when you get to Pierre on October 3rd, and what that's going to look like. And we'll go over that committee procedure, caucus differences, and then we'll have time to do that bill work. So just as a little bit of information for you about what the South Dakota legislative committees look like. So there's 14 standing committees in each chamber. All of those committees meet pretty regularly during session. There's always the chance of having some other special committees and things like that, but these are the 14 committees that hear bills and hear testimony and things like that. In the Senate, those committees consist of 7 to 9 members, most of them 7. A couple of the larger committees, such as State Affairs, will have more and have that 9 number. And so then the House committees, they consist of 13 to 15 members, the same things. Members are selected by those in leadership, so the majority and minority leaders work with the President Pro Tem and the Speaker of the House to assign those committees. And then we have all of the committees listed there. Some of them meet more regularly during session. Some of them only meet a couple of times, like retirement laws. That committee often just meets 2, maybe 3 times a session, not as often because they have fewer bills and things like that. So next, I'm excited to introduce our guest speaker, Representative Caleb Fink. Representative Fink represents District 21, so Bonhomme, Charles Mix, Gregory, and Tripp counties, and he serves on the Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee, Military and Veterans Affairs, and the Transportation Committee. He's an SDSU grad and a 4-H alum, and we're excited to have him here today. I'll let him talk a little bit more about himself and the committees and go from there.
Cool. Thanks, Janae. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you guys today. Wanted to just introduce myself, Caleb Fink, District 21 down here. I'm a farmer by trade, so that's what I'm doing each and every day. This got me out of moving bales this afternoon, so I got to come inside and relax for a little bit. So as soon as we're done, back to working outside. So a little bit about myself. Born and raised in Tripp, South Dakota on the farm here. Graduated high school in 2011 from Tripp, Delmont, and went to South Dakota State University, where I got my degree in agricultural leadership and minors in music and agronomy both. I was pretty highly active in a lot of musical things while I was there. I actually started off as a music major and then just decided to go a different route with things. So that's a little bit about my educational background, a little bit about how I got involved in the legislature. When I was in high school as a senior, I got to go out to peer and be a page. I was a term 1 page, and so I served for the first 2 weeks of session and found it quite interesting. Got to go back and serve the 9th week of session that year as they needed a little bit of help. At that point in time, that's how the page program worked. And so was able to have that opportunity, which was really cool. And then, kind of after that, I thought, well, that was kind of neat, but I didn't really expect myself to come back up, even though when you're in the Capitol, you'll find that many legislators will tell you you'll find your way back at some point someday. Then in college, I got involved with student government, and I had an advisor that said, hey, you should really think about going and being an intern. And interns basically work for one of the caucuses, either the Democrat or the Republican caucus, and they work with the legislature in a particular chamber, so you're either in the House or the Senate for the whole session. And so that's, I did that in the legislative term of 2013, and I've stayed engaged ever since. After that, I got involved in student government at SDSU, got my feet wet doing a little bit of lobbying on behalf of the students, and then took a run right after I graduated and lost. And then 2 years later, in the meantime, I was hired on as an aide to come back out and work with the Appropriations Committee. So I did that for 2 years and got to know and understand the state budget and the process that goes through. And that committee process we can touch on a little bit, but is a little different than the rest of the committees by and large. But then ran in 2018 and won a seat out here in District 21, and so been serving since. So so a little bit about why I've decided to run is because as I was in peer over those few years, it was an environment that I was really proud to be a part of. And I really thought that the people of South Dakota could definitely benefit from a little bit younger voice. That's not always the best thing. Sometimes experience is really good too. But sometimes a fresh perspective is what things need. Just an outside look from somebody that hasn't been doing this for, a long time, or somebody that's just like I said, just a fresh perspective. And so I had some folks that encouraged me to run, and so I did, and that's kind of how I got out there. Committees then over the last 2 years, Janae touched on that a little bit. I've been assigned to the Transportation Committee, and then this past year, the newly formed Military and Veterans Affairs Committee, and then I've been serving on the Ag and Natural Resources Committee, and then new in 2020 here, I had an opportunity to step up and fill a vice chair role, and so that's been really interesting and very exciting. So we'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the committees, and that's kind of depending on which committee you're talking about. By and large, what you guys are looking at is the standing legislative committees that meet, on a every other day basis during session, right? So that list that Janae was showing just a little while ago, and those committees really their job is to filter through all the legislation that comes through. So per South Dakota statute, every bill that gets filed during session must have an open public hearing in a committee. So it absolutely has to go to a committee. It can't be bypassed. It can't go straight to the floor. It has to go through a committee first. And so the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem of the Senate divvy up and decide where those bills and what committees they're going to go to. The committee chairs then schedule them for their hearings. So we just work with the sponsors of those bills to make sure that the people that want to testify are available, and we schedule those in. And then it's a pretty simple format once you get into committee. So if your bill is on the schedule, your bill comes up and we have to take public testimony, and then we have to take final action. So we can't just leave a bill kind of hanging. We can obviously defer a bill if we need more time to work through it. But that process always starts with proponent testimony. And so we leave the mic open for any member of the public, and they can come up and talk about why they think the bill is a good idea. Then we give an opportunity for opponent testimony. So anybody that's on the opposite side of that viewpoint on that bill is able to come up and talk about why they think it shouldn't pass. We give a short opportunity for rebuttal, and then there's time for the committee to ask questions of those people that have brought information to the committee. And so whether that's for or against, we get to ask. We usually have plenty of time to ask all the questions that we need to. And if we come to a point where there's questions that we don't have answers to, obviously we have the opportunity to defer those bills to the next committee meeting to a point. Obviously we have some deadlines we have to meet too, but by and large, once that's done, we have some committee discussion, and then the committee has to take definitive action, which means that we either have to pass the bill or we have to kill the bill, one or the other. So motions would be either to do pass, to table, or to defer to the 41st day, which I don't know, Janae, if you guys have covered that, but that's kind of a unique motion in South Dakota because we only have a maximum of 40 days allowable by the Constitution. There never will be a 41st legislative day, and so deferring a bill to the 41st day is a little nicer way of killing a bill and defeating it. But it also serves a procedural purpose, and this is maybe something good for you guys to note. So if you make a tabling motion, tabling motions are unique in the fact that you can't debate them, right? So once somebody has made a tabling motion, it's immediately followed by a roll call vote, and that's it. If the vote passes, you're done. If it fails, then you go back and you need to make additional motions. But in a motion to defer to the 41st day, it follows the same rules as if you were debating whether to defer it to the next day. And so that's a debatable motion, which gives people an opportunity to speak and say, this is why I don't think this bill is fit for prime time right now, or it needs some work. We should try it next year, or whatever the case may be. So that's kind of the big difference. So that's a little bit on the purpose. And then obviously we can talk about that later if there's some questions. The Ag and Natural Resources Committee falls into that standing category. But if you talk about something like appropriations, they do some bill work, and so they would follow that same format, but they also do probably 2/3 to 3/4 of their work is really in the budget, and that's just a little bit different format. And then you've got other committees, the Interim Committees and the Rules Review Committee and retirement laws and things like that. Some of those committees have a very specific purpose, and maybe it's to oversee a program or provide oversight or insight on different things, and so they're not necessarily dealing with bills, but they function just in a little bit different fashion. So that's a little bit about that. Once the bills get through the process, you guys know what happens after that. When they get down to the floor, they work their way through, and they may end up on the committee on the opposite side. So in the other chamber, if it started in the House, obviously it has to make it through both the House committee and the Senate counterpart committee before it would ever be, completely through the process. So public testimony is one of the things that I think we pride ourselves on in South Dakota. And the fact that we have open public testimony and it's required, right? So it's not like DC where if the bill was introduced and passed off to one of the committee chairs, in DC they could pocket veto something. And so they stick that bill in their pocket and it may never see the light of day again, right? Where in South Dakota, per our Constitution and codified laws, that's not allowed to happen. And so everything gets a much more fair trial, if you will, is open and transparent, and everybody gets to see what's going on. So with that said, then I think the other thing you wanted to talk about was caucuses, but Janae, do you want to see if there's any questions about committees before I move on to talking about caucus?
Yeah, that sounds good. Does anybody have any questions about the committee process or what that looks like? So maybe can you explain how anybody can come in and testify, and maybe a best practice if you're going to come in and testify
Sure.
for the committee?
Yeah. So let's say that, you take bill XYZ, right? And you're really interested in it. Either you're really for it or you're really against it, right? One way or another. So if it's something that you feel strongly about and you want to testify, my advice would be if you're looking at the bill and you don't know when it's going to be scheduled for testimony, we post those 2 days in advance, but in the real world, 2 days isn't a whole lot of time to, get yourself scheduled to make sure that you can get the time off to get all the way up to peer or whatever. Definitely talk with one of your local representatives or talk with the sponsor of that piece of legislation and just say, hey, could you let me know, when this is going to be testified or when this is going to be up in committee, or, what your best guess is so that I can kind of prepare, because I would like to come and testify. That would kind of be step number one in my book. And then once it's scheduled, condense your thoughts, write something down just a little bit to help you. Sometimes getting up in front of a legislative committee can be a little intimidating, but it shouldn't be. We're just there to listen and ask questions that we might have. And so anyone is welcome to be a part of that process, and we encourage it, because the more public comments that we get on a particular piece of legislation, the easier it is for us most of the time to make decisions. Sometimes it makes it a little more difficult too, but most of the time, more information is better. And so once that committee has that bill in front of them, you just want to be present that day. You'd come into the committee room. There'd be a clipboard in the back of the room for you to sign in, and you just put your name down for the record. That way it gets entered in, and you would say whether you're for or against, and that clipboard gets taken up as well to the committee chair, so the committee chair can make sure that everybody that came, that signed in, that says, I want to testify, is allowed to do so, right? So if I'm chairing the Ag Committee and Bill 1001 is up, I'm going to look at my clipboard that's in front of me and see that, okay, there's 5 people that want to testify in favor, and there's 6 people that want to testify in opposition, right? And so I'm going to make extra effort to make sure that, okay, if I've gotten through 4 and there's still not a 5th person, as long as there's due time available, I'm just going to call for another person and say, hey, I know there's somebody else that was signed up. And after that, I just, do a blanket call if there's anybody else that didn't sign in that wanted to testify. And if there is, then we just pass them the clipboard and make sure they get signed in for record purposes. But, so once it's your turn, you just come on up and state your name in front of the microphone and talk about why you're there to talk about it. Keep your points as clear and concise as you can. We have to keep things moving, but at the same time, convey the information that you have to convey about your issue. So that'd be kind of my comments to, kind of best practices, what to do if you get out there. And certainly Janae would have a lot of experience with that as well.
Caleb, is there an age limit on individuals that can testify?
So typically speaking, right, once you're 18, you're a voter in South Dakota. And so at that point, you don't need anybody else's permission. Typically speaking, we don't see a lot of folks coming to testify that aren't registered voters yet. But if they are, I'm not 100% sure. Janae might be able to help me with that. I don't know if there's any technical rule that says you can or can't testify. Certainly we'd, recommend coming with your advisors or a parent or someone and just, communicate that ahead of time that you've got a particularly young individual that wants to be active and engaged in the process. And I can't foresee very many situations where we wouldn't want to make that happen, right? The more people that can be engaged, the better. So.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's not an age, a minimum age for testimony, but just best practices, let people know. I know we've had high schoolers, even some middle school individuals come and read testimony or express their testimony on various bills that applied to them. So.
Right. Exactly. Anything else about committees?
Caleb, did you talk about a new committee that was added? Did I hear that at the beginning?
Yep. So there was a new committee added this the beginning of this past legislative session in 2018. We added the Military and Veterans Affairs Committee. Previous to this past session, this past 2 years, the House did not have that committee, and previous to the prior 2 years before that, the Senate didn't have that committee either. That's a new committee. It's a fairly usual committee that you see across other states. And so that was part of the reason why it was suggested that, we maybe need to have a Military and Veterans Affairs Committee. Certainly we have a Veterans Affairs Department in the state, and they do a lot of work with our veterans and with our active military on a variety of different situations. And there's a number of different laws and statutes that apply specifically for veterans, financial assistance and things like that. And so just having a committee specific to some of those issues made a lot of sense. Also looking forward, many of you know that we've got a lot of development going to be happening with the new bombers coming out to Ellsworth. And so having a committee that would be able in the future, if we have legislative issues specific to, military and veterans affairs type relations, we'd have a committee with hopefully with legislators that are a little more experts in that field, right? So I served in that committee. I don't have any military background myself, so I serve in kind of that civilian perspective. But we have a number of folks that have served on that are either active National Guard, active military, or retired in various capacities and know and understand how these things work. So that's kind of why. So that's kind of historic, right? We haven't created any new standing legislative committees in a very long time. So that's kind of cool. Anything else on committees? Okay, seeing none, I'll move on to caucus a little bit. So caucuses happen, typically, they change from day to day depending on what's going on with the schedule on the floor. But typically caucuses happen right before floor session each day in both chambers and for both parties, right? So typically we start caucus about 1 o'clock or so if session's scheduled to start at 2, unless we have a particularly big log of bills on the calendar, we may start at 12:30 or 12 or just depending on what's going on for the day. And so really caucus is a time for the different political parties to be able to gather their members together on chamber specific. So the House Republicans caucus, the Senate Republicans caucus, the House Democrats and the Senate Democrats. Sometimes they caucus together, but typically most everybody caucuses before session. And really that's just a time for everyone in those parties to get together and just know and understand what's going to happen on the floor that day, right? So get your minds wrapped around which bills are coming up. If anybody has, sometimes bills get scheduled for the floor because when they come out of committee, they automatically get added to the calendar. And then the sponsor of that bill says, wait, I'm not ready to give my floor speech yet. And so, they convey that to the speaker or the speaker pro tem, or the president pro tem, and they let the caucuses know in both the Republican and the Democrat side and say, okay, these couple of bills aren't going to actually happen today. And so just it's a way for us to get organized a little bit. So that's kind of one function, and it helps us keep things really rolling and moving on the floor for the day. Then the second function too is as a party for everyone to kind of organize their thoughts and know how many folks are really passionate about an issue, kind of giving us a heads up on how many people want to stand up and speak on a particular issue. And sometimes it's one of the big differences between the Republicans and the Democrats, right, is the Republicans, we have a closed caucus and the Democrats have an open caucus. And so we don't allow members of the public in for the Republican caucus. And part of that is just for the simple reason, sometimes caucus is an ability for us to be able to ask questions about a bill that we wouldn't normally otherwise ask for fear of maybe sounding like you don't know enough about the subject or something along those lines. And so it gives us a few answers on that. But it's really, we try to not debate the bills ahead of time because we want to save that for the floor, right? That's where that needs to happen. That discussion needs to happen on the floor in front of the public. And And that's where those decisions get made. And the Democrats do a lot of the same thing. The other thing that caucus does, kind of the third point, is it serves as a really good tool for us to keep up on the appropriations process as that's moving through session. So if you know a little bit about how the budgeting process works, right, the appropriators start meeting the same time we do, right at the beginning of session, and they meet every day. And rather than the normal committees meet for 2 hours, either 7:45 to 9:45 and then 10 to noon. The appropriations, they start at about 7:30 in the morning and they meet all the way until noon every day. Sometimes they meet all the way up until the time we go into session at 2. And they do just an incredible amount of work and take an incredible amount of testimony about all the different financial pieces that go into putting the state budget together. And obviously it's really difficult for there's 18 members on that committee, and that's a joint committee between the House and the Senate. So there's only 9 House members and 9 Senate members. And it's a way for the members to come back to the caucus and kind of keep us updated on what's going on in appropriations, so that when we get to the end of session, when the budget bills actually come out, when we're voting on those, it's not like, okay, we've been dealing with all these policy issues all session. Now we got to talk about the finances and, what's going on. And, there's no way you could catch up on that kind of detail and know what's going on in 1 week or 2 weeks time at the end of session. So it gives them, we spend quite a bit of time talking about finances and the budget as to what's going on there, for us to ask questions and for us to raise concerns so that the appropriators can go gather more information and ask more questions. So that's a little bit about caucus and why that's important. It's a important part of the process that keeps everything moving along. So any questions about that?
We'll go over a little bit what caucus will look like later in the webinar for them and their 4-H legislature program and things like that. But yeah, I think the purpose is really just to touch base again, right, as legislators, and just make sure everyone has the information. And Caleb, touch on maybe the amount of bills that you as legislators go through in that 38 to 40 day period, and maybe why caucus and committees are so important with that part of it.
Right. That's another good point. So that kind of brings the committees and the caucus into perspective. So any given legislative session, right, the number of bills will vary greatly from year to year. I think the record number of bills in any one given session was somewhere around 800. And then the very low end of that is in the kind of upper 200s, low 300s, right? Typically, of the last few years, we see anywhere from 400 to 600 bills, each session, right? And so when you start thinking about that, if you go onto the LRC website, I encourage you to do this if you're curious, go back to legislative session and go to bills and just start scrolling through that list and just randomly pick a couple of bills. You might not know anything of what they're about, but pick a couple of bills out and then go pull up the bill text and start reading through it and note 2 things. One, the complexity of some of the legislation, right? So some legislation is very policy driven. It's like, okay, the speed limit should be this. Right? That's very easy to understand. But sometimes policies can be, when you start getting into insurance law and real estate law and alcohol laws, believe it or not, some of those laws are incredibly detailed and very complex. And so they're not as easy to read through and understand. And they also typically, the more complex you get with some of that legislation, the length of the bills gets to be quite long. It's not uncommon for us to have bills that are, I would say I don't know what the actual average is, but I would say most bills are probably under 10 pages, right? But it's not uncommon for bills to be 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 pages in length. And so for us as legislators, there's no way possible in 38 days, unless that's the only thing that you did, was to sit down and just read through every bill from start to finish. And you might be able to get that done, but you may not understand what it's talking about, right? And so the committee serves an important process in that Not everyone needs to read all the bills, because the bills have to make it through committee first. So if it's a bill that goes to Health and Human Services, okay, I'm probably not going to read through those bills right after they get dropped on the House floor, because they've got to go to that Health and Human Services committee first. And if they make it out of Health and Human Services and they're headed to the floor where I'm going to have to vote on it, now I know that it must be a fairly decent idea, because at least half of those members on that committee thought it was good enough to have a floor debate on it. So I need to do two things. I need to read and understand the bill. And number two, I probably need to start asking around with lobbyists and different folks that testified and say, okay, tell me about the proponent side, tell me about the opponent side of this bill. What are the pros? What are the cons? Need to understand that. And just by having that committee process, you reduce that number of bills probably from 500 down to 250 right off the bat. I mean, most bills don't make it through committee. And then the caucus really steps in, because if we've been busy doing things and the committees have been busy working, it's not uncommon that we might have 40 different bills to debate on the floor in a single day. And we need to know and understand all of those bills. And like I said, there's maybe a handful of them that are really simple bills that are very easy to understand. Everybody understands what's going on. It's either a yes or no vote, no big deal. But there are also going to be probably a number of bills on that calendar for that day that are a lot more complex, that you might need a lawyer to understand what it actually says, right? And so that's another important piece of caucus, is for being able to understand just what the bill is, not necessarily why you should be for it or why you should be against it, just understanding what does the bill accomplish and what does it not accomplish. So that hopefully clarifies that just a little bit for you.
Any other questions regarding caucus? So Caleb, maybe as we kind of finish things out, these participants have gone through and written their first bill. We actually used one of your bills as our example bill in our packet. And just as a good example of, adding language and subtracting language, things like that. You're mowing ditches.
Oh, yes.
Yes. So do you have any, advice for them? So they're moving in more to the editing stage of their bill. So as they start thinking through, and all of their bills pertain to specifically the South Dakota 4-H program,
right.
Policies they have. And so maybe some advice for them on how to fine tune things, how to present those bills in committee and presenting them, when they get to the House floor, and how to do that a little bit.
So probably my best advice on that, and specific to the mowing bill, right? I have quite the track record with that bill. I've tried it 2 years, haven't made it either of the years, but actually this summer, the Transportation Commission adopted some new language in administrative rules to accomplish some of what the bill was looking for. And so part of the reason that that bill has been a troubled piece of legislation in the last few years is it's not simple, okay? There's a lot of moving pieces. It affects a lot of people. There's a lot of parts to it. And even though it may not be a lot of language, there's just a lot going on with it. And so the more simple you can keep your bill, the better. Also, making sure that your language is very clear. That is something not necessarily specific to my bill, but specific to a lot of legislation. And this is the advice that I get from my drafters in LRC quite often is, what do you want the bill to say? And you shouldn't have to come up with any really complicated legal jargon to make it say that. The law just needs to simply say what you want it to say so that it has the effect that you want. Because ultimately, we as legislators pass the laws and we help create the laws. But on the enforcement end of the laws, right, you have a whole nother side, and that is somebody in the judicial system will have to interpret that law. And so you want it written very clearly so that it's interpreted the way that you intended it to be. Not that they can kind of read in between the lines and say, well, I think they meant this, but we're not really sure. So this is how we're going to interpret it. You want to avoid that. So keep it simple. and that would probably be my best advice on your legislation going forward. And always, always, always have somebody else read through it. You may have read through that thing 50 times and it makes perfect sense to you. And even sometimes I'll hand a piece of legislation off to my wife who has no legislative experience whatsoever and just say, okay, can you read through this? Does this make any sense at all? And hopefully the answer is yes. And if the answer is no, then I need to just think about it a little bit differently and simplify.
All right, does anybody else have any questions for Representative Fink before we kind of move on to what we'll be doing in the 4-H legislature program? None? Well, thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate all of your knowledge and help in that, and you know, learning a little bit more. And I'm sure everyone appreciates not just hearing our voices all the time. It's nice to have another expert around to fill in some of that information. So thank you so much for being here today, and we appreciate it. And
absolutely. And if anybody ever has any questions, you know, Janae knows how to get a hold of me. She's got my contact information, as well as if you go on the Legislative Research Council's website, you can find all of my contact information there. Feel free to contact me anytime with any kind of questions that you might have. So,
thank you.
All right, guys, so we're going to move into kind of talking about what our process in the 4-H legislature is going to look like. It's very similar to what Caleb was describing there, but we want to kind of prepare you guys a little bit so you know what to expect when we get to Pierre on October 3rd. So this is kind of our general schedule. It might change a little bit, but this is basically what we're thinking. So our committees will start at 10:20 in the morning, and we'll have all your guys' bills that you've written pre-assigned to a committee. And you guys will each get your own committee assignment as well. Once all the bills are turned in, we'll be assigning you guys to different committees. So you'll know those beforehand. And so we'll have kind of your committee agenda prepared, and you'll hear that public testimony. You'll hear, you know, that discussion that Caleb talked about, and you guys will take action on all those bills. And then your caucuses are going to meet from 1 to 1:30 in the afternoon. So that's right before you guys go to the floor. You'll also be split up into those beforehand. They'll be, as it says here, randomly assigned, but we'll make sure that there's legislators from each of the committees represented. And the purpose for that is, you know, to make sure that you can talk about what happened in those committee meetings. And if there's not somebody from the committee, you won't know what happened with those bills. And so we want to make sure that everybody is represented, all the committees are represented there as well. So our committee procedure is, we're going to run it just like they do in the South Dakota legislature. So your bill title is going to be announced. They'll call for proponent testimony, and then they'll call for opponent testimony. And then you as committee members will be able to ask questions, whether that be ask questions of your fellow legislators, whether that be ask questions of the testifiers. So whenever people come and testify on a bill, whether they're a proponent or an opponent, the legislators on the committee are able to ask them questions about their testimony. And so that kind of gives them an opportunity to clear things up, maybe something they missed that they meant to say, or maybe something that just they want some more information about. When committee questions are done, then it moves to committee discussion, which is where committee discussion and or action. so that's where you as legislators get to kind of say, I support this bill and this is why, or I don't support this bill and this is why, or I'm having troubles with this part, or this is also where you can add amendments, you can make changes, you can make a motion to pass the bill or to send it to the 41st day. So that committee action kind of goes with the discussion there. And we'll talk in just a little bit about all those different ways that a bill can leave the committee. And then after action is taken, whether that bill passes, whether it is passed as amended, whether it's sent to the 41st day, or whether it's sent to the floor without recommendation, then they call for the next bill. If it's the final bill of the day, then committee is adjourned. So these are all the different ways that a bill can leave committee. The first one, and kind of the most obvious one, is a do pass. So that means the bill is passing out of committee as written, no changes. Majority members there voted to pass the bill, and it's getting sent to the floor. And then the do pass as amended would be that the committee made some changes to the bill, whether that be a small change or larger changes, as we kind of talked about in one of our earlier webinars. We talked about that hog house amendment that kind of overtakes the entire bill. That would be considered an amendment. So if any type of change happens, whether it be changing one word to changing the entire bill, it would go out as do pass as amended. Sending it to the 41st day, as Caleb mentioned, that essentially kills the bill. Because South Dakota law only allows for those 40 legislative days, sending it to the 41st means that it will not be heard again. Now, for us, we only have one legislative day, but we'll still follow that language of sending it to the 41st day. And then one of the most, I think, unique ones that can happen in a committee is sending it to the floor without recommendation. Now, this doesn't happen very often, maybe once or twice a session, if that. But this just kind of means that the committee just can't come to a decision. Maybe they don't have a strong feeling either way. Maybe they're unsure of some of the consequences or benefits of the bill, but they just feel like it deserves a hearing of the entire body. So they kind of don't have a strong feeling, but they feel that it's important that either the entire House or the entire Senate hears the bill. Now, the tricky part about this one is it gets sent to the floor without recommendation, but that means it's not actually on the calendar. So they actually have to take a vote on the floor to calendar the bill to get it put on the agenda. So the bill kind of has to be voted on twice before it can actually get heard. So that's kind of why this one's not very common. Typically, the committee just makes a decision, a yes or no. If they've got some concerns with it, they'll likely just either change it in committee, or they'll just vote to send it to the 41st day and encourage them to bring it back the next year with those modifications. But that without recommendation, like I said, it's not very common, but it is one of the options for sending a bill out of committee. And then our caucuses, I think Caleb covered this really well, so I won't go into detail about it. You guys as 4-H legislators will still meet as a caucus. You obviously won't be split by political party like they do in the state legislature, but you will be discussing those same things. So you'll be talking about those bills that passed out of committee. Those ones that didn't make it out of committee, it's not really worth your time to discuss them in caucus because they won't be heard on the floor. So typically you spend your time talking about those bills that you'll be discussing on the floor. So if one of your one of your fellow caucus members heard this bill in committee, they can kind of tell you, what did the proponent testimony say? What did the opponent say? What were some of the questions and concerns that were brought up, so that you're prepared to hear that on the floor. And if some of those questions that were maybe brought up in committee weren't answered, you can also ask them on the floor of the sponsor of the bill. So like Caleb said, there's no public input for these. It's just really a time for them to talk about what's going to happen on the floor, kind of get their ducks in a row, and prepare for the full floor session. So does anybody have any questions about committees, caucuses, kind of what it's going to look like for us, or anything like that?